Lieutenant W.J.E. Crissy was stationed forward with Repair Unit No. 1 when the first shell hit the ship. He sent Seaman Edwards below, and he and Chief Brown checked the ship for water power. He turned to on aid to the wounded being brought to the forecastle, and he got 4 men together who didn't know how to give sirettes, showed them how, and got them started. The wounded were coming down. Altogether there would be 34 officers and men killed and 94 wounded, most of them by shells fired from American ships. Lieutenant Crissy and the crew turned to save ship and men. He led crews to plug holes in the hull and got emergency pumps working. Ensign J.P. Marsh got permission to leave his battle station in the Director and went below to the ammunition handling room where he found temperatures rising to 130 degrees. He organized a crew and began moving ammunition, moving the hoist by hand because the power was out. He toured the magazines and found those under guns No. 1 and No. 2 in danger of flooding, so he dogged the spaces and then went forward to the fire room to help get out the dead and wounded and moved them to the fantail, where he organized a treatment party. Ensign F.D. Case was hit by shrapnel when one of those first shells came in. Severely wounded and weak from loss of blood, he refused help and set about aiding others. He helped carry 2 wounded men to the battle dressing station in the wardroom and was manning one end of a stretcher when he collapsed. He could not move but lay against the deckhouse, directing others, and he could not walk, so gave his shoes to a man whose shoes had been burned off his feet. The officers were not the only heroes by far. Machinist's mate First Class R.H. Parker heard the safety valves of the forward engine plant blow and ran through intense shellfire to shut off the steam valves forward, thus saving the lives of a dozen men trapped by steam in the forward fire room and engine room. He then ran and shut off fuel supply to the engines involved and went into the steam-filled compartment and began bringing out the wounded. Radioman Petty Officer First Class W.M. Selleck had both legs blown off and was taken to the wardroom. He refused treatment. "There's nothing you can do for me, fellows," he said. "Go ahead and do something for those others." Then he died. Pattern maker First Class W.H. Swain, Jr. was the only surviving man with any medical training. He took care of the wounded on the ship and instructed others while he ran the station in the crew's head aft. Radio technician First Class J.M. Flaherty was wounded by shrapnel. After giving himself morphine, he went around the ship giving aid to others. He would not stop for treatment until the more serious cases had been handled. Gunner's mate Second Class C.S. Canada rushed down into the bilges of the steam and engine spaces and removed unexploded shells there. He helped with the removal of the ammunition, although the temperature rose above 146 degrees in the magazines. He watched the rising temperatures and kept the captain informed, and when the ammunition was out of the way, he moved to the emergency pumps. Machinist's mate Third Class R.W. Brown was with Canada, feeling around trying to get those unexploded shells out of the bilges in the dark. Gunner's mate Third Class J.R. Howard was put out of action by a shell that knocked his gun out, and then went below to rescue wounded. Water tender Third Class W.G. Hurtle, wounded so that he could not move his legs, sat on the deck and made others bring men to him and then treated them. Machinist's mate Second Class D.W. Barnes beat out flames on men with his bare hands, and torpedoman's mate Third Class W.W. Nagel stuck to his post in the forward torpedo tube mount after his companion was wounded, and single-handedly got away the torpedoes by hand, with shrapnel flying around him, firing by percussion when the automatic machinery failed. There were a dozen others. Coxswain L. Kelly was stationed aft on 40mm gun No. 1 when a shell ploughed in and set the ammunition afire. He grabbed a mattress and rushed into the blaze and extinguished it before the shells began blowing up, and that was about par for the men that day. At 4:20 p.m. the Albert W. Grant was dead in the water, operating her guns on manual but still fighting. By 4:40 p.m. she was in touch with others by blinker, asking for a tow, and at 5 p.m. the Newcomb's boat came alongside with a doctor. 43 minutes later the Newcomb was alongside, and the wounded were being transferred. By 6:40 p.m. the Newcomb began to tow her back to safer waters. As soon as Admiral Oldendorf learned that the destroyers were under fire, he ordered the battle line and cruisers to cease fire, and the pressure on the Albert W. Grant was removed. It was the cruisers that had been hitting her, luckily for the Grant, mistaking her for a Japanese destroyer, and not the battleships with their big guns. The destroyers had done a pretty good job of wrecking the Japanese move through the strait, and what they did not do, the cruisers and battleships undertook. They had begun firing at 3:51 a.m. and continued for 14 minutes, the Yamashiro and the Mogami heading bravely into this fire, along with little Shigure. Although Admiral Nishimura sent one message to the Fuso at 3:52 a.m., that was the last one, and soon Nishimura was either too stunned or too busy to send any more, or his communications were knocked out by an early shot. The firing was heavy. The West Virginia, for example, fired 93 rounds of armor-piercing 16-inch shells in those 14 minutes. The Tennessee fired 69 rounds of 14-inch ammunition. The California, 63 rounds. And there was the Maryland, which fired 48 rounds, and all those cruisers shooting so fast that they were lit up like Broadway shops. The Mississippi fired only one salvo, and the Pennsylvania did not fire at all, but there was a huge rain of steel on the two major ships coming up the strait, while the Japanese hit only the unfortunate Grant and made a near miss on the Claxton from a heavy gun. The Japanese were so busy taking fire that they could hardly shoot. The cruisers fired literally thousands of rounds of ammunition. The Columbia alone fired 1,100 rounds, and many of these hits, so many that the Japanese were stunned. About 10 minutes after this punishment began, even little Shigura was feeling it. "I was receiving a terrific bombardment," said Commander Nishino. "There were so many near misses that the gyro compass was out. The ship was constantly trembling from force of near misses, and the wireless was out. If that was the condition on the Shigur, which was squirming like a baby all this time, and took only one shell aboard, imagine what it was like on the main targets, the big ships, where the hits were numbered in the dozens and scores." Destroyer Captain Smoot, who was watching, called the gunfire devastating, accurate, and beautiful. But then Admiral Oldendorf learned of the Albert W. Grant's plight, caught in the fire of the American cruisers, and he ordered the firing ceased. It saved the Grant, and it gave the Japanese a respite. The Yamashiro had been burning so brightly that she was lit up from end to end. She increased her speed to 15 knots and turned and headed south. Soon she capsized and sank, taking down all but a handful of her crew. The Mogami, the cruiser, had been taking a great deal of punishment, with shells falling even on her bridge and killing the executive officer, commanding officer, and all others there. But it was shells in the engine room that began to bring her down, and she slowed. Still she was fighting. It was her torpedoes that came close to the Richard P. Leary in that last torpedo attack. For 10 minutes the firing stopped, and the Mogami and the Yamashiro moved away, along with Shigure. Here Admiral Oldendorf recalls how it seemed to him that night. When the situation as to Desron 56 had been clarified, the order was given then to resume fire, but most of the enemy ships had disappeared from the screen. Destroyer Squadron 10 was then ordered to report to the officer in tactical command, and upon reporting was directed to proceed down the strait and attack the enemy. As soon as it was thought that Destroyer Squadron 10 was on its way, the left flank forces were then taken into the straits to pursue the enemy. On proceeding down the straits, I noticed 2 ships on fire, one of them burning very heavily, and the other had been burning, but the fires were getting under control. As we approached, I noted destroyers at the sides of the straits firing, and not knowing whether those destroyers were our own or the enemy's, I could not take them under fire. If they were enemy destroyers, I was proceeding into torpedo waters, so having gotten the right-hand ship of the 2 enemy ships proceeding down the straits within range. I turned across the straits on course 250°, and when the 5 cruisers were around the turns, Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, Denver, and Columbia, I gave the order to open fire on the right-hand ship, which was making about 11 knots. The heavy cruisers opened fire immediately, and started hitting the right-hand ship, which again burst into flame. The Columbia and Denver opened fire on 2 destroyers. One was standing by the right-hand ship and another standing by the left-hand ship. A few salvos and those destroyers disappeared. When it was evident that the right-hand ship had been hit badly and would not escape the cruisers, then turned and retired up the strait to try to find Destroyer Squadron 10. As soon as daylight arrived, the cruiser divisions were again turned south down the straits, and a large destroyer of the Terutsaki class was seen on the eastern side of the strait. The bow of the ship had been blown off about down to turret 2 by a torpedo, and a single stack made it look like a tanker with a stack aft. The Denver and the Columbia took the Terutsaki-class destroyer under fire, and it shortly disappeared from the scene. At this time there were 8 columns of smoke arising from the surface of the ocean, but very little, if any, of the upper works of any ships could be seen. A plane was fired from the Louisville to investigate and to attempt to ascertain if there were any ships to the southward of this group of burning ships, which were about in the middle of Surigao Strait. The plane's report was negative, and just about this time Admiral Kincaid sent a message to Admiral Oldendorf, reporting that the escort carriers east of Leyte Gulf were under heavy fire. Oldendorf was to move to that scene as quickly as he could, and Oldendorf had just sent down 2 destroyers to pick up Japanese survivors. But now he recalled them, and as a result of this and the unfriendly natives on the Philippines shores, there were very few survivors of the sunken Japanese ships. As Admiral Oldendorf turned, the Mogami, burning and smoking, was moving south, with the Shigur moving along too. They were all that remained of Admiral Nishimura's force. They and the hulks in the water half of the Fuso was still floating and the survivors swimming, trying to make up their minds whether to face the Filipinos with their guns and bolos they used them too, that day, or the sharks and other dangers of the sea. As far as Admiral Nishimura was concerned, all that had happened had occurred between 3 a.m. and 4:19 a.m., the time at which the Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking down the admiral and all but a handful of his crew. And if he did not send any messages to Admiral Shima, coming up behind him, there was less reason to believe this was a matter of jealousy or pique than a question of communications. If Shigur's communications were out, and she was not even hit, then what must have been the state of the Yamashiro when she had thousands of shells thrown at her? As Admiral Shima's little force of cruisers and destroyers steamed up toward Surigao Strait behind Nishimura, Shima had brave notions of rushing through the strait and torpedoing any ships that moved. In fact, he was thinking in terms of doing what the Americans did to Admiral Nishimura. The weather for Shima continued to worsen as it had for Nishimura, and from 10 p.m. the Shima force had the feeling that it was being tracked by American torpedo boats. What they probably heard on the radio were reports on Nishimura's force. About midnight, Shima's communications men heard over the voice radio that Nishimura was engaged. The weather was now so bad in Shima's position that from his flagship the destroyers and even their wakes were sometimes lost from sight, and the formation had to be kept together by frequent corrections on the talk-between-ships system. Then, about 1 a.m., Shima had his first indication of action. He saw gun flashes ahead when the squalls let up enough for him to see anything. The voice radio was fragmentary and most unsatisfactory this night, and the fragments were tantalizing and frightening. Hit by one torpedo came a report from the commander of Battleship Division 2, and then, infuriatingly, there was nothing else. Dead silence, and then came another transmission from Nishimura, ordering a turn, obviously a battle maneuver, then silence again. Admiral Shima's ships were having their communications problems too. The destroyer Ushio lost her talk-between-ships transmitter sometime during the night, and in the squally weather this made formation keeping a serious problem. How serious? Here is a report from one of Shima's staff officers. Suddenly sighted mountains on the port bow through break in the clouds. Shortly thereafter was able to make out the coastline, turn 4.5, and at this time issued orders so that destroyers would fall in astern. Up to this time we were unable to confirm their positions, and they were becoming separated to the north. It was at this time that the commander of the left flank screening ship Ushio, the voice telephone of which was inoperable, on his own judgment swung radically around to the left, and thus saved the ship from running aground. The ship then fell in astern. From about this time the squall ceased, but visibility was still extremely unfavourable. At midnight, Shima was about 40 miles behind Nishimura, and it was about 3:15 a.m. when things began to happen to convince Admiral Shima that all was not going as it ought to. The column had just changed into attack formation, with the flagship in the van, and then changed course at 3:15 a.m. to 010 degrees. Out from the Panayon coast at this moment came an American torpedo boat, PT-134 in fact, which came skimming in, launched torpedoes and strafed. The attack alerted the Japanese but did not sink any ships. The torpedo missed. Then, 3:25 a.m., the cruiser Abukuma and the other ships were swinging left, when suddenly out of the darkness came another PT attack, and the Abukuma was hit on the port side beneath the bridge by a torpedo. She began taking water very quickly, and soon was going down by the bow, it seemed. Her speed fell to 10 knots, and she dropped out of the formation. As the other ships turned north and swept on, Shima had no extras in his formation to leave a destroyer as guard for the Abukuma. The cruiser would have to fight her own battle and make her own way home. Shima's task was to storm the Strait and get at the ships in Leyte Gulf as Kurita came down from the north. On the bridge of the Abukuma, they assessed the damage, and the explosion had come on the side of the forward radio room and had killed nearly all the personnel handling radio and talk between ships. Communications again, but the Abukuma had to fight her own battle now, with the torpedo boats and the deadly sea. Shima, in the flagship Nachi, increased speed to 26 knots and moved on. On the Abukuma, the Japanese did not know they had been the victims of an ironic fate. PT-137, which had fired the torpedo that put the cruiser out of action this morning, had not been firing at her at all, but at one of the destroyers steaming south to take place in the new battle formation that Shima had just ordered. The torpedo had missed the destroyer and hit the cruiser beyond it, and Shima now moved on in single battle formation, the Nachi ahead, bearing the admiral himself, then the cruiser Ashigara, and then 4 destroyers in a line. He headed into storms, squalls, and the confusion of battle that is only later separated by intelligence men and historians. We sighted a large fire and a burning fireball a considerable distance ahead, said Commander Kokichi Mori, one of Shima's staff officers, recalling the battle later, and as we approached we saw 2 large ships afire. We concluded that they must be the 2 battleships of Battleship Division 2 Yamashiro and Fuso. Actually, they were the 2 halves of the Fuso, which were completely afire and burning furiously, silhouetting their hulls. Also, at this time, sighted ahead near the limit of visibility flashes from friendly and enemy gunfire, and were able to conclude that Mogami and the destroyers of the 3rd section had penetrated and were now engaged in furious combat. Moving past the burning pyres of steel and wood, Shima's little fleet went on at 26 knots. By 4 a.m. they still had not found the Americans, deterred by the heavy smoke laid down by the destroyers and from the battle that had been fought in the Strait, and was still being fought at that time by the cruisers and battleships laying down their rain of fire. The smoke was so dense to the north that the Japanese could see nothing, and their radar showed nothing either. Shima was reduced to guessing conditions from what he saw and heard. Here is what he assumed. The enemy has concentrated his strength and is lying in wait in the narrow sector of the northern entrance of Surigao Strait. He is laying smoke to cut off our visibility and will carry out radar-directed fire from behind the smoke or launch a simultaneous attack immediately after we have penetrated. Admiral Shima's decision. When we sight or detect by radar the enemy, the cruisers will execute a torpedo attack, and then the destroyers will penetrate and attack. Then, while the cruisers give support to the destroyers, battle disposition will be formed with the destroyers in the van, and the assault will be launched. A brave plan. The Japanese did not know, of course, that the Americans had 3 squadrons of destroyers immediately available, plus those battleships and cruisers, and that only 1 American destroyer had so far been put out of action. In fact, the Japanese of the Shima force knew nothing at all beyond what they saw, and they saw incorrectly the result of the Fuso's explosion. By 4:15 a.m., when Admiral Oldendorf had ordered the ceasefire to protect the Albert W. Grant from further destruction by the American cruisers, Admiral Shima was still confused. Shima was becoming concerned a few moments later when he sighted a ship completely afire and dead in the water. He did not know if it was friend or foe, but he did not like it. In his nervousness, he ordered an attack on 2 pips that came up on the Nachi's radar. It was determined later by American naval authorities that what Admiral Shima saw on the radar scope that day was not an American ship or ships, or any ship or ships at all, but the 2 Hibuson Islands, which were about 15 miles away, and at that distance might have looked to excited men like ships about half that distance away. So the Japanese attack by torpedoes damaged nothing visible, but it did bring about further Japanese tragedy. While the attack was in progress, officers on the bridge were watching the flaming ship that seemed to be dead in the water. They ascertained that it was the Mogami, not dead, but moving very slowly southward. And as the attack proceeded, and the cruisers changed course to launch the torpedoes, the Admiral ordered right rudder, not knowing that the ship ahead was moving. Right rudder it was, and the new course took them directly toward the stricken ship. Later it was learned that the Mogami had been so sorely hurt that all the officers on her bridge had been killed. Steering had been knocked out from the bridge and moved to manual steering aft, and it was all that could be done to keep her on a straight course moving south. She could not get out of the way, and the cruisers were bearing down on her. On came the Shima cruisers at 26 knots, and on limped the Mogami directly into their line of approach. "We turned rudder full to starboard," said Commander Mori, but it was too late, and the Mogami's bow crashed into the Nachi's port quarter at an angle of about 10 degrees. The Ashigara was luckier. She managed to evade by swinging to the outside, but the Nachi caught it squarely. The knifing bow of the Mogami sliced through the shell and into the anchor windlass room, which flooded, and then into the steering room, which began to flood. Bells rang and sirens screamed, and the Nachi's speed fell immediately to 18 knots. The captain turned her south then, and ordered his officers to report on the damage, to see if the ships could still go into battle. For 10 minutes it was in balance. Then the reports came that she was still battle-worthy, and Admiral Shima ordered the ship to head north once again. But hardly had that decision been made than Admiral Shima had some cautious second thoughts. He did not know the situation up ahead. The smoke, and what he had seen of burning ships, was upsetting. Equally upsetting was the damage done to the Nachi, which certainly cut her down as a fighting ship. He decided that discretion was the course to follow, and that he would not valorously plunge into the fray, as had Nishimura, but would live to fight another day. He would withdraw from the battle area temporarily then, after regrouping his force end, determining the Kurita movements, he would plan the future course of action, and a second attempt in coordination with the main body. Now, whether by main body he meant Kurita or Admiral Nishimura is interesting but not very important. For Admiral Shima was backing off to try to find out what was happening to the other Japanese forces. During the period of his approach, the tremendous gunfire ahead had suddenly stopped. He had seen burning ships, all Japanese, and he had not seen any non-burning Japanese ships from the Nishimura force. All the information Shima had about the advance of Kurita to the north was negative. The bombings of that day, the reports that Kurita had turned back, and then the firm order from Admiral Toyoda that all would go ahead, no matter what the cost, was certainly inherent in that message. Having made his decision, Admiral Shima sent a radio dispatch to Admiral Mikawa, commander of the southwest area in Manila, under whose command he had been placed in the confusion of making the show plan go, and to the other commands that were supposed to have such information. At the same time, he ordered his ships to reverse course, and headed back south, whence he had come. About half an hour after the turn back, Admiral Shima sighted the destroyer Shigura, and asked her to join up. At about 6:30 a.m., the little force arrived at the southern entrance to Surigao Strait, and there encountered some more of those Bumblebee PT boats, which promptly attacked. The American boats fired torpedoes and their machine guns, but no serious damage seems to have been done to either side. PT 321 was hit, but not sunk as Shima thought was. Here, apparently, Admiral Shima had some second thoughts about retirement, or wanted to see if he was being chased. He ordered the destroyers to turn around and make full speed north, which they did for half an hour. Admiral Shima ordered the ships back again, and by dawn he had picked up the Abukuma, which had made emergency repairs and was limping south. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over, and the Japanese had not forced their way through, but had lost the battleship Fuso, the battleship Yamashiro, the destroyers Yamagumo and Michishio, and the cruiser Mogami, destroyer Asagumo, and cruiser Abukuma had been sorely hurt. And the Nachi was also in trouble from the collision with the Mogami. dodging torpedo boats and coming into fights with several PT-194 was hit and several men were hurt. The Japanese stood in toward the Mindanao shore, making 16 knots and retiring in as good order as was possible under the circumstances. The Mogami, screened by one destroyer, moved along more slowly, at 12 to 14 knots. The Americans were chasing, but the smoke, the confusion of battle, and the inability to find an enemy that was moving determinedly away militated against renewal of the battle in these night hours. It had been relatively simple when the Japanese were trying to force the strait, and the Americans were lined across it, determined that they would not pass. But even with radar, tracking down the survivors was something else again, and there was nothing easy about it. The cruisers and 6 destroyers of Division 10 went south hunting, but not carelessly, and the Japanese still had sharp teeth, and the Americans knew it. Here is the report from Claxton, Divisional Command Ship. The orders came at 4:32 a.m. in the morning. Com Destroyer Division 10 Ray with 3 ships in the van and 3 in the rear of the battle line ordered his ships to clear the battleship formation and form column natural order astern of the Claxton, and the Claxton went to 20 knots. It was intended to go to 30 knots when second section was closed to 4,000 yards. Radar contact on the retiring enemy unit was regained at 5:13 a.m. at a range of 31,000 yards, about 17 miles. It was only one ship, moving at about 13 or 14 knots, probably Mogami. By 5:15 a.m. we realized that it was going to be a long chase, and that daylight would soon arrive with its complications in connection with a surprise torpedo attack. Course of 160 degree, speed 25 knots was held, and plans were made to change course to the south at about 5:40 a.m. after clearing our cruiser formation, thus placing us in the middle of the strait. 2 additional contacts were established at 5:25 a.m., and their plot appeared to be very erratic. The tendency showed slow movement on the part of these targets in a southwesterly direction, but by 5:38 a.m. the contacts disappeared from the screen, presumably having sunk. As the division was about to clear the cruiser formation and pursue the single contact we had on the screen at the time, orders were received to cease the torpedo attack and join the screen of the left flank cruisers, and at 5:50 a.m. the Claxton took station in the formation. As daylight came at about 5:52 a.m., the Claxton sighted numerous Japanese survivors in the water very close aboard, and upon orders from Oldendorf manoeuvred independently to pick them up as prisoners. It is estimated that there were a minimum of 150 men within a radius of 2,000 yards, but among those men was an officer. They had come upon the survivors, or most of them, of the Yamashiro, and the officer was determined that the survivors should not be captured by the Americans, but instead should go to a watery grave that would be fitting for Japanese naval heroes. 3 prisoners finally decided to come aboard. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Hayler had found the destroyer Asagumo, with her bow shot off, and was taking her under fire with the cruisers. The Claxton joined, and by 7:15 a.m., one fleeing badly damaged destroyer, presumably of the Shiguo class, came within gun range, and we opened fire. The cruisers and 2 other destroyers were shooting at the poor Asagumo too. At 7:18 a.m. the destroyer exploded and sank, after which our course was reversed and the formation proceeded north at 20 knots. And something was brewing in the northeast, something very dangerous. Admiral Kurita had broken through San Bernardino Strait and was already engaging the very vulnerable escort carriers with his battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. All the American forces were needed up north. As for the Japanese, their defeat here was exemplified by the 3 prisoners taken from the Yamashiro. Imagine the thousands of men who had been thrown into the water by the sinking of the Yamashiro, the Fuso, and the lesser ships. Literally thousands of men died in the water in the darkness, mostly because no one stopped to help them, partly because they would accept no help from the enemy. And if there is any need to emphasize the breakup of the Japanese here, the story of the destroyer Shiguo tells the tale. On her way back from the battle, the Shiguo was so shaken by near misses and the one hit that she lost steering control, and for about half an hour was dead in the water, victim of any American ship that might find her. As the crew was making emergency repairs, Admiral Shima's force came by, said Nishino, and he identified himself, but did not offer any information about the battle. As with everything about the Japanese side of this battle, there is confusion about the chronology of the report. It is not very likely, however, that Commander Nishino would tell such a story on himself, long after the fact, if it were not true. So great had been the shock of the battle, so complete the American surprise of the Japanese, that Nishino must have lost any taste for strategy. All he knew was that he was not responsible to Admiral Shima, and he was desperately loyal to Admiral Nishimura. And as for poor Nishimura, he had gone down with the Yamashiro, the first of the fleet leaders of this engagement, to meet his death. Admiral Kurita was a worried man, and since the morning of October 24, when he heard from Admiral Nishimura that he had been attacked by American bombers, Kurita had been concerned about the ability of the Japanese forces to link up in Leyte Gulf. As the day wore on and Kurita surveyed the power of the American planes and the damage they did to his force, he built up in his mind the same kind of damage for Nishimura. That mental image was to have its effect on his thinking, as can be seen throughout this account. The basic problem of the Japanese in this whole complex operation was an almost total failure in communications. Admiral Kurita should have known, hour by hour, what was happening to the Nishimura, Shima, and Ozawa forces, and also what Admirals Mikawa, Fukudome, and Onishi were up to in Manila and the rest of the Philippines to support his desperate drive for the Leyte beaches. Instead, he received virtually no information, and the same must be said about the reports he received about American dispositions. As of the afternoon of October 24, he placed the American task forces 80 to 100 miles off the coast of Samar, northeast of Leyte Gulf. That was the picture he had fixed in his mind. It, too, was to be vitally important in his later thinking. The damage to Kurita's force troubled him greatly. Such things as the partial destruction of the Nagato's communications system made his task that much harder. But the task was set, and if there had been any hesitation in Admiral Kurita's mind about the importance that Imperial Naval Headquarters placed on the pursuit of this mission to its end, it had been removed by the strong tone of that last message from Admiral Toyoda. Toyoda's message to Combined Fleet Headquarters that evening reflected a confidence that Admiral Kurita did not necessarily feel. This fleet intends to charge into Leyte Gulf at 11 a.m. on the 25th without regard for any damage we may suffer, he said, and in the log of the force, the words chancing annihilation were used. But at this time, about 10 p.m., Admiral Kurita was still hoping for a better performance the next day from the land-based air forces of Admirals Fukudome and Onishi. Of the 32 ships that had set out from Brunei Bay, 22 were now left to form a single column at 11:30 a.m. that night and begin moving through the narrow strait. The Japanese accounts say there were no lights, some say it was pitch dark, but Admiral Kurita said it was good light weather and the moon was very bright, so that he could navigate visually to bring his force through. It seemed easy, easier still when they emerged on the far side of the strait safely at 12:35 a.m. Admiral Kurita had been bracing himself for the flash of guns. He knew only too well how easy it would be for the Americans to do to him what in a short time they would be doing to Admiral Nishimura farther south. Admiral Kurita was as suspicious as a wolf approaching a cabin, and he formed his force on a broad 13-mile front and ran eastward until 3 a.m., and then moved southeast down the coast of Samar toward the target area. An hour before sunrise, the force proposed to move into the circular pattern destroyers outside, battleships in the center that had been used the day before and had enabled the Japanese to throw up a strong anti-aircraft fire. Kurita was in the dark, literally and figuratively, and at 2:30 a.m. there had been one message from Nishimura, saying he was entering Surigao Strait, and that he had seen nothing except some American torpedo boats. It seemed odd, and at 3:35 a.m. Nishimura had reported that he had sighted 3 enemy ships. Then came long and ominous silence, and at 5:32 a.m. a message from Shima saying that Nishimura's force had been destroyed. Just like that, 2 battleships snuffed out, and the Mogami seriously afire, and then nothing. Actually, flying boats conducting night radar searches had been out that night, working well. They had found 4 enemy ship concentrations and had reported on them thoroughly by 4 a.m. The information had been passed along to the land-based air headquarters and used as their basis for attack formations for the coming day's operations. but nobody thought to inform Admiral Kurita until long after the Battle off Samar was over. Here is the way it looked this night to Admiral Ugaki. We safely navigated the San Bernardino Strait, taking advantage of the light clouds which filmed the brightness of the moon phase of the moon. Turning east, we formed number 19 alert cruising disposition, and at 4 a.m. we changed course to 150° and proceeded south 10 miles off the coast of Samar. We expected the penetration into Leyte Gulf at 11 a.m. after first rendezvousing with the 3rd Section Nishimura at 9 a.m. at a point 10 miles east of Suluan Island. Communications operations of the reconnaissance airplanes, which had deployed to land bases on the 24th, were not smoothly affected, and we were unable to obtain their reconnaissance reports. The reason, guessed by Admiral Ugaki, change of flagship and the inferior communications setup of the Yamato, jamming by the Americans, and inferior base communications facilities in the Philippines. It is the rainy season in this area, wrote Admiral Ugaki, and the weather on the east coast is particularly unfavourable. It is almost impossible to determine when day breaks, and scattered dark clouds accompanied by squalls hang low, making visibility poor. At 6:44 a.m., just before the order to form circular formation was issued, 4 masts, apparently destroyers, were suddenly spotted bearing 060 to port, 37 kilometres from Yamato. This was followed by the sighting of 3 carriers, 3 cruisers, and 2 destroyers. Confusion. The Japanese were ready to go into their circular defence formation. Instead, Admiral Kurita ordered the attack. The result was that no heed was taken of order or coordination, said his Chief of Staff later, and Admiral Ugaki was a bit less harsh, recalling it on the same day. It was a surprise encounter since no situation reports had been received since the previous night, and although we had long considered various measures for such an event, the ships, I thought, were extremely slow in reacting because of their lack of enemy information. Measures taken by the fleet headquarters, too, occasionally seemed lacking in promptness. At any rate, at 6:58 a.m. Battleship Division, 1 opened fire with its forward guns at a range of 31 kilometres. The Battle of Samar was joined, and the Japanese were coming down. The left, or outside, was a destroyer screen led by a cruiser. Then came the heavy cruisers Suzuya, Kumano, Chikuma, and Tone. Next grouping was the heavy cruisers Haguro and Chokai, and inshore of them was another destroyer squadron led by a cruiser. 3 miles behind this force steamed the battleships Yamato and Nagato, and alongside Kongo and Haruna. What happens in battle is nowhere better indicated than what happened this morning. Admiral Kurita's lookouts saw planes overhead 14 minutes before they saw the American ships. When they spotted the Americans, they misidentified the ships, in part because the lookouts were not familiar with the profiles of the escort carriers, mostly on converted tanker hulls, and did not know what they were. So one report had it that the area was full of cruisers and heavy fleet carriers. Admiral Kurita's Chief of Staff thought they were up against fleet carriers. So, obviously, did the Admiral. If the shock was great for the Japanese, who were after all on the offensive, imagine what it must have been for the Americans in the ships ahead. For they rested secure in the belief that no Japanese force was going to debouch from San Bernardino Strait with the pride of America's fleets, the new fast battleships, lying across that body. Admiral Oldendorf was extremely proud of the fact that his battleships at Surigao Strait had performed so well. Actually, as it had turned out, the Pennsylvania's fire control system was so ancient that she never did get into action. Mississippi trained her guns first on the stops, and finally got away 1 salvo, and Old Maryland only managed 6 salvos. The work was done by the West Virginia, California, Tennessee, and by the cruisers. Given the new battleships and the larger force of Admiral Kurita with the Yamato's 18-inch guns, largest in the world, it still would scarcely have been a fair fight for the Japanese. In his flag plot on Wasatch, Admiral Kincaid had spent a busy, and until now, a relatively satisfactory night. He was conscious of things that did not go right. The destroyer Albert W. Grant got into line of fire by turning the wrong way. One battleship nearly caused a collision when she misunderstood a signal, and the fire control problems of Pennsylvania were nothing short of disgraceful. This was an admiral's concern. Let the men under him have the credit for the valor and the victory. Let him not have too many problems with ships and men. He had planned as carefully as he could for every contingency. Knowing the ammunition difficulties of his force because of the need to bombard those beaches, he had taken 2 ammunition ships and put them up off the coast of Samar, safely away from nearly everybody else, so that in case somebody got them, they would go up alone and not take the fleet with them into oblivion. He was very lucky so far. The Japanese had not bothered those ammunition ships at all, although they had bothered just about everybody else. Here is Admiral Kincaid's recollection of that night. The night before 24th, I had directed Admiral Sprague to have attack groups ready on deck of the jeep carriers, looking forward to what might be the morning situation. I'd directed him to send one attack group down into Mindanao to get any stragglers or escapees from the night action, which he did. I'd also directed him at daylight to send a search to northward along the San Bernardino Strait. I did that mostly out of curiosity to know what had gone on up there, because I thought that Admiral Lee was there with Task Force 34, and I didn't expect to find anything that we had not planned. I was quite wrong in that, unfortunately. That search did not get off. Sprague got off his anti-submarine patrols, and he got off an attack group against stragglers from the night actions. The order to fly these searches was given by Admiral Sprague to Admiral Stump in the escort carrier group known as Taffy 2. 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers and escorts. Admiral Stump passed the order to the escort carrier Omni Bay, and, which did not get the order until just after 5 a.m., had difficulty in getting the planes ready on the wet, careening decks, and did not get the strike launched until 6:58 a.m., the moment at which the Japanese ships appeared out of the squalls and began firing. Also, Admiral Kincaid had made other plans for search. I had directed the PBYs to make a night flight, and they had trouble and got no results. Part of the trouble came with the 5 planes Black Cats, or special patrol bombers equipped for night flying. They were anchored in Hunangan Bay, Leyte, where they had barely arrived. Only 3 could take off that night, and only one of these headed toward Kurita's force. He flew to San Bernardino Strait, arrived before Admiral Kurita entered it, and missed him completely. The Black Cats were wary, not of the Japanese, but of the American ships. Every time they'd get near one of our ships, they'd be fired at, and I think they spent most of their time trying to avoid our ships, rather than advancing to see what they could find around San Bernardino Strait, said Admiral Kincaid. One could hardly blame either the Black Cats or the American ships for that. No matter how badly the Japanese air performed in the daytime, a constant succession of Japanese Snoopas could be heard at night, and they did not sound unlike the PBYs, particularly in the noises men heard at sea, so the circumstances built up. As far as Kincaid was concerned, had Lee been in the Straits with Task Force 34, he would, if he had made any contacts, have reported them immediately to everyone. The mere fact that in the morning there was no report from him seemed to indicate that everything was all right. Yet there were little signs of concern, even when all the avenues seemed covered. In the middle of the night or early in the morning of the 25th, I called a meeting in my cabin of the staff, and everyone connected with operations to see if there was anything they had forgotten to do, or anything doing that was wrong, to see if anything needed change or to be added to. All went over the situation. The meeting ended at 4 a.m., and as Commander Dick Cruzen, the operations officer, was leaving, he turned and said, "Admiral, I can think of only one thing. We've never asked Halsey directly if Task Force 34 is guarding San Bernardino Strait, all right?" said Admiral Kincaid. "Send it." The message went out, but Halsey did not receive it for 2.5 hours. All this time, Admiral Kurita was steaming in watchful curiosity, wondering why the Americans had left the back door unguarded. Another communications failure. At this time, the American escort carriers were moving inshore from their night operating areas off the coast, and were heading into the northeast wind to launch planes to carry out their various missions. At about 2 a.m., Admiral Kincaid instructed me to prepare to pursue the damaged vessels of the Surigao Strait battle, the ones that had escaped. So we got busy about 3 hours before daylight, and loaded torpedoes and the heavy bombs in order to catch the ones that were undamaged and were escaping, and to dispense those who were damaged and who couldn't move very fast. Rear Admiral T.F. Sprague was in the south, east of Dinagat Island, so he would send the planes farthest west. Rear Admiral Felix Stump in Taffy 2 was operating off Homonohon Island, and he would take care of the check on San Bernardino and put up an air patrol over the Leyte ships. So would Rear Admiral Clifford Sprague in the north. It was Cliff Sprague's ships that came into sight when Admiral Kurita saw those American masts that morning. Here was the vaunted American task force, said Kurita's men, and about time too. Planes could be seen taking off from the decks of the American ship, and by heaven-sent opportunity we are dashing to attack the enemy carriers, radioed Admiral Kurita to Combined Fleet Headquarters. Our first objective is to destroy the flight decks, then the task force, what Kurita thought was obvious. This was the southern of the three groups of the American task force. What a chance to hit the enemy, smashing those important carriers, and for Kurita, like Admiral Yamamoto, under whom he had trained, had absorbed the carrier admiral's philosophy. Get the carriers first, then get the fleet. At Kurita's order, the battleships opened fire range 31 kilometers, or 18.6 miles, and damaged one ship with 2 or 3 salvos, then changed to another target. The enemy reversed course and began retiring eastward under cover of smoke and rain squalls. For some reason, wrote Admiral Ugaki, who was on his bridge on the Yamato, Fleet Headquarters ordered the battleships and cruisers to attack and the destroyer squadrons to follow in the rear. The attack course of the entire fleet was now divided, making one doubt the intensity of the spirit for close-quarter combat. So Ugaki suggested to Kurita's chief of staff that he be given control of the battleships, and that was done, and at about 7 a.m. it was said that there were 6 carriers. From 7:06 a.m. we advanced generally on an easterly course and employed our secondary guns at the enemy who appeared from behind the smoke. It was generally about this time that one carrier was sunk, one carrier was heavily damaged, one cruiser was sunk, etc. We were now rapidly approaching the enemy. The range by radar was 2,200 meters, and visibility was gradually improving from the east. We hoped to destroy the enemy at one blow if he came out from behind the smoke. In the meantime, we were attacked by enemy aircraft. Several salvos from medium-caliber enemy guns fell near Yamato, and 2 shells hit the starboard after gallery and outer boat shed. Admiral Ugaki's observations represented the desperate American counterattack as the little jeep carriers, whose flank speed was 17.5 knots as compared to the Japanese speed of almost twice that, tried desperately to escape. Yet it could not move south into Leyte Gulf because they would endanger the entire 7th Fleet, being restricted in such narrow waters. In other words, when Admiral Sprague asked Admiral Kincaid if he could move, the answer was no. If the carriers had to be sacrificed to save the fleet, so it would be. There were 3 lines of defense for the Americans. To run for it, which would at least keep the Japanese from ramming them, to put the destroyers to work screening and fighting, or to use those escort carrier planes for all they were worth, and the Americans chose all 3. Ziggy Sprague, the admiral in charge of Taffy 3, began to act. He ordered his ships to flank speed. He ordered the destroyers into action. He ordered every flyable plane into the air. 3 minutes after the attack began, he broadcast a plain English report and call for assistance from anyone. This report and the reply were picked up by the Japanese, and they were to have profound influence on the battle later. The destroyer screen of Taffy 3 consisted of the Hull, the command ship, Heermann and the Johnston, and they swung into action. The Johnston was first. Here is the way it went. This ship had secured from morning alert, the first carrier's plane strike, ASP anti-submarine patrol and CAP combat air patrol patrols had been launched. At about 6:50 a.m. word was received by talk between ships. We are being pursued by a large portion of the Japanese fleet. General quarters was sounded, and this task unit headed in an easterly direction to launch planes, and at this time the enemy fleet was about 34,000 yards distant, bearing approximately 345 degrees from us. The Japanese force was closing the range rapidly, their speed being 22 to 25 knots. The captain, Commander Ernest E. Evans, immediately gave orders to the engine room to light off all boilers and make maximum speed. Also ordered the engine room to commence making funnel smoke and ordered the smoke screen generator detail to make smoke. Later, the ship's crew proudly claimed that they had started smoke 10 minutes before the order came from the flagship. This ship then commenced zigzagging back and forth between the enemy and our own formation, laying a heavy smoke screen. By 7 a.m., the carriers had launched all available planes, and the formation turned to a southwesterly course. Ships were informed by talk between ships at this time for destroyers to make smoke, and this unit had been under fire by the Japanese fleet since 6:50 a.m. Johnston's time was 8 minutes off, and at 7:10 a.m. the range to the nearest cruiser had closed to 18,000 yards, and fire was opened with the 5-inch battery on this cruiser. The planes were at this time striking the Japanese force, completing their strike at about 7:15 a.m. As soon as this ship commenced firing on the enemy, we in turn were taken under heavy fire from more than one Japanese unit. This ship was straddled during this period, and as a result of the heavy gunfire, the captain gave the order to stand by for torpedo attack at starboard and turned and headed for the enemy. Torpedoes were set on low speed because of heavy fire to ensure the firing of our torpedoes. This decision was made by the captain to ensure being within torpedo range and to ensure being able to fire our torpedoes even if this heavy fire should put the ships out of action. Everything Commander Evans did that day was to the end of smashing the enemy. He was a single-minded, purposeful man, part Cherokee, heavy-set and determined. He was meeting the moment for which he seemed to be created, and the ship closed to within 10,000 yards of the enemy before the torpedoes were fired. The point of aim was the leading cruiser. The torpedoes were fired. At a depth of 6 feet and a spread of 1 degree was used. All 10 torpedoes were fired at 3-second intervals and were observed to run hot, straight and normal. During the run-in, the 5-inch guns fired in rapid salvo fire with the leading cruiser as the point of aim. Over 200 rounds were fired at this cruiser, and numerous hits were visually observed. It is believed that this heavy cruiser was severely damaged by at least 45-inch shells. The men of the Johnston were disappointed not to see the results of their torpedoes, but they were retiring behind a heavy smoke screen at the time the torpedoes should hit. The cruiser they were aiming at, it was determined later, was the Kurmano, and she and the other cruisers were firing on the Johnston all this time, using dye shells of various colours, mustard, purple, yellow, by which the observers could track their aim. Results of the torpedo attack were not observed visually. It can be positively stated, however, that 2 and possibly 3 underwater explosions were heard by 2 officers and many enlisted men in the repair parties at the time our torpedoes were scheduled to hit. Upon emerging a minute later from the smokescreen, the leading enemy cruiser was observed to be burning furiously astern. Then the Johnston began to catch it, partly because her angle of attack was such that all the Japanese cruisers within range could fire on her, and they did, and at this time, 7:30 a.m., this ship was hit for the first time. It is believed we were hit by 3 14-inch projectiles. Those were battleship shells, followed 30 seconds later by 3 6-inch projectiles from the cruisers. These hits knocked out the after-fire room and engine room, all power to the steering engine, all power to the after 3 5-inch guns, and rendered the gyro compass useless. The ship was slowed to 17 knots, about half its regular top speed, and steering had to be moved aft and done manually. The radar went out for 5 minutes, and the radar antenna was snapped off by a shell, but the fire direction radar was still operable. The guns had to be controlled either manually or partially so, instead of automatically by computer. Luckily, after having taken this smashing, the Johnston managed to find a rain squall and hid in it for 10 minutes while the officers found the damage and began controlling it. Then the Johnston went back into the fight, first taking on a Japanese destroyer, then bulldogging after the cruisers again. All this was done in the storm by radar, and 100 rounds were fired. And at 7:50 a.m. Johnston's time was still not that of the others received orders by talk between ships for small boys destroyers to make torpedo attack. Here is the talk between ships report of what happened in the next few minutes. It was all done in code, using code names for the ships and code designations for the maneuvers. But the sense of urgency certainly lies in these signals made between ships. The order came from the flagship at 7:45 a.m. Small boys form up for second attack. Over then the transmissions hurried up. This is Taffy 3, all Great Danes stand by to open. This is Georgia up overture from Wilco, out Taffy 3. Are your torpedoes ready? Over. Affirmative. This is affirmative Dreadnought. This is Taffy 3. All small boys go out and launch torpedo attack. This is overture Wilco. This is Taffy 3. All carriers make smoke over torpedoes are heading toward carrier group Mercury 3 from execute upon receipt signal. Turn Taffy 3 shackle George X-ray, unshackle Fido from. Are you hit over Taffy 3? This is Fido, negative. Taffy 3 from Fish, headed for Great Danes out Juggernaut 8:02 a.m. Mercury 3 from Taffy 3, Fatima 4. This is Fatima 4:14 a.m. Mercury 3 from Taffy 3 8:20 a.m. Taffy 3 from Catnip Fido from Taffy 3. This is Fido 8:21 a.m. Taffy 3 from Catnip 8:24 a.m. This is Taffy 3 8:25 a.m. This is Taffy 3. Small boys from Taffy 3 8:26 a.m. Taffy 3 from Mongrel from Taffy 3. This is Figliff. This is Taffy 3 small boys from Taffy 3. This is Mongrel. This is Overture. This is Figleaf signal execute upon receipt. Turns hackle Nan Peter King. Unshackle out. These were manoeuvring instructions to the fleet from Admiral Ziggy Sprague. Do you have planes coming in on 290 negative, but they show light. Signal execute shackle George King Roger unshackle out. The forward engine room is flooded. Say again. Have you been hit? Negative good going. I have been hit hard. I have lost one engine over Roger out small boys on my starboard quarter intercept enemy cruiser, coming on my port quarter. Intercept enemy heavy cruiser coming in on Bendix port quarter. I have him closing in now. We have no fish left. Stay on station and continue smoking. We have no fish left. Roger out on starboard quarter. Interpose with smoke between me and enemy heavy cruiser. Wilco out, Wilco out, Wilco out. When the order had come for small boys to make torpedo attack, the destroyers formed a formation with the Johnston, which had already fired, furnishing fire support for the Hole, Heermann and Roberts, which were going in. As we turned to retire after the other destroyers had fired their torpedoes, range closed to 6,000 yards on the leading Japanese cruiser, and many hits were obtained on it at this time, and retirement was commenced with the aid of a heavy smokescreen. At approximately 8:10 a.m., the Johnston emerged from a heavy smokescreen, only to find the USS Heermann on our starboard bow on a collision course with us at a distance of about 200 yards. The captain backed full on the one remaining engine, and the Heermann was observed to back on all engines. A collision was thus avoided by the narrowest possible margin. At about 8:20 a.m. there suddenly appeared out of the smoke a battleship of the Congo class, 7,000 yards distant on our port beam. By this time, the captain had given the order not to fire on any target unless we could see it, the reason being that enemy and friendly ships were now in the melee. Approximately 40 rounds were fired at the Japanese battleship, at our necessarily reduced rate of fire, before retiring behind our own smokescreen and before being taken under fire by this battleship. Several hits were observed on the Pagoda superstructure, and a carrier, the Gambia Bay, was hit. This ship attempted to draw fire away from the Gambia Bay by taking the cruiser under fire at this time. The range was closed to 6,000 yards, and maximum fire was brought to bear on this heavy cruiser. This attempt, as was to be expected, was unsuccessful, despite numerous hits being observed. At about 8:40 a.m. fire was checked when it became obvious that the Japanese destroyers on our port hand were closing rapidly on the carriers. Upon receiving this information from combat, the captain directed our course toward the enemy destroyers, who were deployed in a column with the apparent leader in the van, followed by two divisions consisting of 3 destroyers apiece. The Japanese destroyers were sighted at a range of about 10,000 yards, and fire was immediately opened on the destroyer leader. Our fire appeared to be extremely effective, and the range continued to close to about 7,000 yards. This ship was hit several times during this one encounter by 5-inch shells. Approximately 12 hits were obtained on the leading Japanese destroyer before a most amazing thing happened.